Welcome to the Empathy Stories channel, where every story brings us closer to understanding the human heart. Today, we share a powerful tale of a poor man who, on a stormy night, discovers two abandoned children and uncovers a heartbreaking truth about their mother. Join us as we explore the depth of sacrifice and the unexpected acts of kindness that can change lives forever. The storm was relentless that night. The wind howled through the village of Willow Creek, pushing the rain in sheets against the windows and turning the dirt roads into muddy rivers. It felt as if the world had been swallowed by the storm, leaving everything shrouded in darkness and the distant rumble of thunder. Few were brave or foolish enough to be out in such weather. Ben, however, didn't mind the storm. He had spent years in places where weather like this was just another part of life. But tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a stillness that made his thoughts swirl in ways he couldn't escape. Ben pulled his coat tighter around him and trudged forward, his head lowered against the fierce wind. He wasn't sure where he was going, but walking helped. It helped him push aside the weight of his life, the constant struggle to make ends meet, the unrelenting pressure that had followed him from one day to the next. But as his feet crunched over the soaked earth, something unusual caught his attention, a faint cry, almost drowned by the storm, but unmistakable nonetheless. It was a soft, tremulous sound that cut through the chaos of the rain. Ben stopped in his tracks, his heart tightening. The cry came again, fragile and full of pain. His instincts kicked in. He turned toward the sound, eyes scanning the darkened path ahead. The village had grown silent, and the storm only amplified the quiet, making everything seem far more ominous than it should have. Following the sound, Ben pushed through the wet branches of a thicket, his coat snagging on the wet undergrowth. The cry grew louder, more desperate. When he emerged into a small clearing, he saw her, clutching two tiny bundles against the trunk of an old oak tree, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her clothes, soaked through and clinging to her thin frame, offered little protection from the storm, and the babies she held were trembling, their tiny bodies exposed to the cold. Ben hesitated for a moment, taking in the scene. The girl, no older than 15, looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Please, don't come closer," she pleaded, her voice shaking. It was clear she was scared, her body tensed as though she was expecting some kind of attack. "I'm not here to hurt you," Ben said gently, stepping closer but keeping a safe distance. "I just want to help." He raised his hands in a calming gesture, trying to reassure her. He could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else there too, a sense of desperation, like she had nowhere else to turn. The girl, who introduced herself as Emily, looked at him, her eyes still filled with terror. They're my brothers," she whispered, holding the babies closer to her chest. "They have no one else." Ben's heart clenched as he saw the tiny faces of the twins, Noah and Lucas, pale and trembling from the cold. They couldn't have been more than a few months old. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, but it felt as though everything in the world had paused in that moment. "You don't have to do this alone," Ben said, stepping forward slowly. He didn't know why he felt such a strong urge to help, but something in his chest told him this was important. "Let me help you." Emily's eyes flickered with doubt, her gaze shifting between the babies and Ben. She hesitated for a long moment, as if weighing her options, before nodding, her voice barely a whisper. "Please help us." Ben didn't wait for another moment. He reached out and gently lifted one of the twins from Emily's arms, feeling the cold weight of the child against his chest. "My house isn't far," he said, wrapping his coat around the tiny body to keep it warm. "Let's get you both inside, out of this storm." Emily tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her, worn from exhaustion. Ben stepped closer and put a steadying arm around her shoulders. "Here, lean on me," he said softly. "We'll make it, just one step at a time." The rain didn't ease as they made their way through the storm, but Ben's steps were firm, and Emily, though trembling, followed closely behind. She kept her eyes on the ground, as if afraid to look up. "They're so cold," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm scared." "I know," Ben replied quietly. But you're not alone. We'll get through this together. When they finally reached Ben's small cottage at the edge of the village, he pushed open the door, ushering Emily inside. The warmth of the fire felt like a dream compared to the biting cold of the storm. Emily sagged against the doorframe, exhausted, as Ben carefully laid the twins by the hearth. Sit by the fire, he instructed, laying out blankets for the babies. Everything will be all right. You're safe here. Emily sank into a chair by the fire, her eyes tired but filled with a mix of gratitude and relief. I don't even know how to thank you, she whispered, her voice heavy with emotion. Ben gave her a kind smile, his own heart softening at the sight of the two tiny, vulnerable bodies now wrapped in warmth. There's no need for thanks, he replied gently. The important thing is that you're safe. The twins, now warm and fed, drifted off to sleep by the fire, their tiny bodies relaxed and peaceful. Ben watched them for a long moment, his heart heavy with the quiet weight of the world, before turning his attention back to Emily. She looked at him, her eyes filled with wonder and disbelief. You're a good man, Ben, she said softly. I was so afraid. I didn't think anyone would care. Ben knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. There's still kindness in the world. Emily, he said quietly, even when it feels like there isn't. Emily hesitated, her gaze flicking nervously between Ben and the two babies in her arms. The wind howled again, sending the rain lashing against their faces. And for a moment, Ben wasn't sure she would refuse him. But then, her shoulders slumped, the tension in her body easing ever so slightly. She nodded, a small, barely perceptible movement. Please help us. Ben didn't hesitate. He knelt beside her, careful not to startle her further, and reached out a hand toward the smaller of the two twins. Emily looked at him for a long moment, then gently handed him Noah, the baby's tiny body shivering in Ben's arms. As he wrapped the child in his coat, he could feel the cold seeping through the fabric, and his heart twisted. The baby was so small, so fragile. There was no way Emily could have carried both of them through the storm on her own. It's not far to my house, Ben said, his voice steady, despite the way his heart was racing. We'll get you all warm and dry. Okay. Emily nodded again, though she looked exhausted. Her legs wobbled slightly as she stood, and Ben reached out instinctively to steady her. She was so young, yet the weight of responsibility in her eyes seemed far older than her years. The journey back to his house wasn't long, but the storm made every step feel like a struggle. The wind whipped through the trees, bending them at odd angles, and the rain was like a constant barrage against their skin. You're doing great, Ben murmured as Emily stumbled once, almost losing her balance in the muck. He offered his shoulder to lean on, and she gratefully took it, her thin body trembling under the strain. We'll get there. Just hold on. But even as he said the words, Ben couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in his chest. Who was this girl? Why was she out here in the middle of the storm with two babies? Where had she come from? And where were their parents? Do you have a home nearby? Ben asked quietly, not wanting to push her too hard, but feeling a deep need to understand what had brought her out here. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper, strained and hoarse. I don't have a home, she said, and then fell silent, her eyes staring straight ahead, as though lost in some distant thought. Ben could hear the faint tremor in her voice, the unspoken weight behind her words. Whatever had happened to her, it was more than just the storm. They continued walking, Ben's pace slow but steady. With each step, Emily grew more quiet, her head slightly lowered as though the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. The rain was relentless, and the wind made it nearly impossible to hear anything else except the rush of water and the occasional crack of thunder in the distance. The storm felt endless, and Ben could sense Emily's exhaustion in every faltering step. When they finally reached the small house on the outskirts of the village, Ben pushed open the door, the warmth from inside immediately hitting him like a wave. He ushered Emily inside quickly, pulling the door shut behind them and blocking out the storm. Come in, quick, he said, trying to sound reassuring as he led her toward the fire. Emily barely reacted, her eyes unfocused and her movements sluggish. As she stepped over the threshold, she seemed to sag with relief, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She sank into the nearest chair, still holding the babies, her chest rising and falling with quiet, labored breaths. Ben set Noah gently down by the fire, wrapping him in a blanket, and turned back to Emily. "I'll get you dry clothes. Just give me a moment." As he hurried around the small room, pulling a blanket from the cupboard and setting it near the fire, he couldn't help but glance at Emily. Her face was drawn, her eyes haunted by something he couldn't understand. She was so young, and yet the sorrow in her eyes made her seem far older. Ben quickly fetched a towel, offering it to her. "Here," he said gently. "It'll help." Emily took the towel with trembling hands, but instead of drying her face, she wrapped it around the babies first, her movements slow and careful. Ben didn't interrupt. He knew that sometimes a mother's instinct was stronger than anything else, even if she wasn't their biological mother. He didn't ask her anything else. There would be time for questions later, when she was ready to talk. For now, all that mattered was getting her and the babies warm and safe. Ben stood by the fire, watching Emily settle the twins near the hearth. She seemed to relax slightly as the warmth enveloped them, her tense shoulders lowering just a fraction. "You're safe here," Ben said softly, though the words felt strangely inadequate. The storm raged on outside, but inside a small house, there was only the crackle of the fire and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the children as they finally fell into a peaceful sleep. By the time they reached Ben's small house on the outskirts of Willow Creek, the storm had only grown fiercer. Ben pushed open the door, thankful for the warmth that greeted them. The crackling of the fire in the hearth filled the otherwise quiet room, offering a stark contrast to the cold, wet world outside. Ben guided Emily inside first, shielding her from the gusts of wind that threatened to push the door shut again. She hesitated, looking around the cozy space, her eyes wide as though she hadn't expected this kind of sanctuary. "Come in, quick," Ben urged, stepping aside to let her pass. He could see how exhausted she was, her face pale, her body thin, as though the storm hadn't been her only hardship. As soon as she stepped inside, she seemed to crumple, her legs giving out from beneath her. Ben caught her by the arm, guiding her to a nearby chair. "Sit down. I'll take care of them." Emily sank into the chair, her eyes closing for a moment, as if the act of simply being indoors was a relief she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Meanwhile, Ben gently laid the twins down on the rug by the fire, wrapping them in warm blankets and starting a pot of tea. His movements were methodical, calm, but his mind was racing. What had happened to Emily? Why were these babies in her care? Alone in the woods, in the middle of a storm? He glanced back at her, his concern deepening. She was staring at the fire, her body shivering slightly, though not from the cold anymore. Ben could see the way she clutched her hands together, the tremors in her fingers. It was as if she was afraid to let go of something she had been holding on to for far too long. Ben returned to her side, handing her a steaming mug of tea. She took it gratefully, her hands shaking as she sipped. "I know you're probably wondering a million things," Ben said quietly, sitting down beside her. "But whatever it is, you're safe now. No one's going to hurt you or your brothers." For a long time, Emily said nothing. The sound of the storm outside was muffled by the thick walls of the house, and the warmth from the fire seemed to ease the tension in the air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emily spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "They're my brothers," she said, her eyes never leaving the fire. "I found them. I didn't know what else to do. They have no one else." Her voice cracked, and she quickly wiped her eyes, trying to regain control of her emotions. "I thought I could protect them. I thought I could keep them safe. But I don't know how long we'll be safe here either." Ben stayed silent, allowing her the space to speak, to let the weight of her words sink into the room. Whatever had happened to Emily and the twins, it was clear that the past was something she couldn't escape easily. After a few moments, Ben spoke again, his voice calm. "You don't have to worry about that right now. For tonight, at least, you don't have to run anymore. He watched as Emily slowly nodded, the flickering light from the fire casting soft shadows across her tired face. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. The twins, now fed and warm, had fallen into a peaceful sleep by the fire, their tiny chests rising and falling with each soft breath. Emily's gaze softened as she watched them, a fleeting look of relief crossing her face for the first time since Ben had found her. For the first time that night, she smiled, though it was faint. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet, almost as if she hadn't meant to speak the words aloud. "I don't know how to thank you." Ben smiled back, his expression warm but gentle. "No need for that. The important thing is that you're safe." There was a long pause as Emily sat back, her eyes growing distant again, lost in her own thoughts. Ben stood to check on the twins, but before he could turn away, Emily spoke once more. We're not alone, are we?" she asked, her voice trembling just a bit. Ben looked over at her, his eyes soft. "No, you're not alone anymore." The storm outside began to lose its intensity, and though the night was still long, the warmth of the fire seemed to quiet the fears that had plagued them. As Ben watched over Emily and the twins, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just the end of their journey, but the beginning of something new. In that moment, surrounded by the crackling fire and the quiet peace of the house, it felt like a fragile hope had taken root. And for once, the storm outside no longer seemed as powerful as the warmth inside. Thank you for watching today's emotional journey. We hope this story moved you to reflect on the strength of the human spirit and the power of compassion. If you were touched by this tale, please like, share, and subscribe to the Empathy Stories channel for more stories that inspire and uplift.